This video was brought to you by Aorus and their range of NVIDIA RTX 30 series cards. With their 2nd generation RT cores and 3rd generation Tensor cores, they have full support for DLSS 2.0 and ray tracing in major games like Cyberpunk 2077. Aorus cards feature customizable LCD edge view displays, a metal backplate, 6 video outputs and a 4-year warranty if you register the card online. Click the link in the description down below to learn more. Hey everyone, so I thought that I would do something a little different today and review a game. And what better choice for my first ever game review than one of the most controversial releases of 2020, Cyberpunk 2077. Now, before I dive in, I want to state that this is a review of the PC version of the game. So the poor last gen console release, whilst entirely inexcusable on the part of CD Projekt Red, will have no bearing on my thoughts of the game. Also, I made the decision that I wanted to play this game many years ago, and because I hate spoilers, I actually stayed away from most of the marketing videos for this game. So whether or not CDPR fulfilled its promises with Cyberpunk 2077 will also play no part in my review. I went into Cyberpunk 2077 with only a few expectations, mainly that it would be an open world Witcher 3 style RPG, but with a cyberpunk setting instead and with a mostly first person perspective. I also assumed that it would be one of the most graphically intensive games to run that I've ever played, and I was right. In Cyberpunk 2077 you play as V, and unlike The Witcher's Geralt of Rivia, you're given a huge amount of customizability of how V looks. Perhaps a little too much customizability if I'm honest. I find this exhaustive character creation menu to be a little misplaced, because I actually found V to be less of a blank canvas for you to play as yourself in than Geralt was. I find V to be a very defined character, one that CDPR wants to tell you a story about, with some light RPG elements. And this isn't a negative for me. I love story-based games, and The Witcher 3 had some epic storytelling within it, so I was all for them trying their hand at some storytelling within the cyberpunk genre. I just think that perhaps they should have gone the same way that the Mass Effect trilogy did, and have a default male and female protagonist with preset designs that then have entirely optional customization, and perhaps include some third-person cutscenes during key story moments. Initially, I think I would have enjoyed Cyberpunk 2077 more if they'd attempted to make it a full play as whoever you want RPG. But I now think that that's extremely ambitious and hard to pull off, especially with a voice-acted protagonist, and as CDPR did such a good job with the storytelling in The Witcher 3, sticking to that style and giving people more of that was just the more obvious choice. You get to pick between 3 life paths for V: Nomad, Street Kid and Corporate, and you get to play through a very small part of the one that you pick before the main game begins. I have read complaints that this intro into the game isn't long enough, but I disagree. Whilst it would have been fun to play my corporate choice for longer, I did see it as a backstory, which implies that it's what happened to V before you're given the reins, rather than it being part of the actual story. Instead, my big complaint here is that it becomes clear that this choice does not make enough of a difference to V's personality. In my opinion, V is a street kid, and if one of the 3 backstories was canon, it would clearly be that one. You can tell this by the way the story plays out and by the way the dialogue is delivered. The overall problem with this character creator, the backstory selection, along with the first person perspective, is that it gives you the impression that V can be whoever you want. But you quickly realise, at least with a female voice actor, which is how I played, that V is a very predefined character with a personality all of her own, and you are very much in her shoes. And that's okay, the game can still be great under those parameters, especially with the high quality of V's voice acting. I just find the way that CDPR have made it so that you craft your own V at the beginning of the game is an unnecessary contradiction that gets the game off to a muddled start. Cyberpunk 2077 takes place in Night City within the Cyberpunk universe, which is a tabletop RPG designed by Mike Pondsmith. Unfortunately, I've never had the opportunity to play the tabletop games in the series, but I do think that CDPR was successful in making this a good first introduction to that universe. It's obvious that there's a history to the world, and that adds to the depth, but you never feel out of the loop. Night City is stunning, but it is a pretty difficult game to run as a result of that. I played on a PC with a Gigabyte RTX 3090 Vision, and this gave me access to both DLSS and ray tracing technologies. DLSS is key to being able to get a playable frame rate with all of the graphical settings, including ray tracing, turned up. However, I still have to make compromises here, as unlike other DLSS implementations, with Cyberpunk 2077, there is a slight noticeable difference with DLSS set to performance mode versus quality mode. Although I'd say that with the settings I played in, it still looked crisper on my 4K display than native 1440p does on a 1440p display. With lower end hardware, your mileage may vary, but having briefly tried running the game on an RTX 2060, which should represent the rough performance of the upcoming entry-level cards this generation, I'd definitely say that the game can still be made to run well and look good, even if your PC isn't crazy high-end. The city is nothing short of breathtaking, and if the game had nothing but its setting and its photo mode, it would still do really well just as a cyberpunk-themed photography simulator. Even towards the end of my playthrough, I still found myself being wowed by the impressive world that CDPR have crafted here, and the soundtrack is equally great to match. However, the more time you put into exploring the world, the more some cracks begin to show. All games start off their design with lofty aspirations and then go through a period of cutting down the scope until they're left with a viable product. But I've never felt so aware of this cutting down process as a player in an open world game, as I have with Cyberpunk 2077. This is mostly because they left so much of the remnants of what they'd hoped to achieve within the game, rather than just removing it completely. Now, I'm sure some of this will come back later in the form of DLC, but I found this to be an occasional immersion breaker. Over time, the civilian and police AI reveal themselves to be quite basic in their actions and behaviour. The poor police chase mechanics isn't quite the huge deal breaker that it would be in a game like Grand Theft Auto though, as the missions and the story rarely have you engage with the police in this way. And unlike the three protagonists in GTA 5, V isn't the type of criminal who would perform armed robberies on small shops and then go on a high-speed chase halfway around the map. Instead, V's story and gameplay mostly focus on more localised engagements against gangs or corporations that have their own security forces. I don't mind this, but it perhaps doesn't take full advantage of the sheer scale of Night City. Sure, you travel between A to B within missions, but there's very rarely edge-of-your-seat gameplay to be had on the journey. The gameplay with the encounters though is fun and engaging. There's many ways you can approach an objective and a flexible skill tree to match. You could go full stealth, found or net running, or you could opt for gunplay or for melee combat. I would argue though that whilst there's diversity to your available approaches, the phrase jack of all trades, master of none does come to mind. Everything is decent, but nothing pushes the gaming industry to new heights individually. There's better shooting games, there's better hacking games, there's better melee games. But when I'm in the mood to play some Cyberpunk 2077, none of those other games would scratch that itch. I do believe that it's the mixture of elements that CDPR have put into this game that allows it to carve out its own territory. Driving in the game is okay. It's sufficient. It's certainly better than I expected given that this is CDPR's first attempt at making an open world game with vehicles in it. Ubisoft, for example, are on their third attempt with the Watch Dogs series and their driving still feels very janky. So while Cyberpunk 2077's driving isn't going to win any awards, it's still not going to get any extreme criticism from me either. The main story is quite short for a CD Projekt Red title and can be completed in around 20 hours. I wanted to experience everything the game had to offer, so I played a couple of side missions for every main mission that I completed. Unfortunately, this ratio was way off and I quickly ran out of main missions to play. This meant that I spent about 30 hours of my time playing Cyberpunk, doing somewhat repetitive side gigs without being able to mix in the main missions to keep the story moving forward. So the pacing isn't great for completionists. With that said, many of the missions within the side quest section of the journal were as, or if not more interesting than the main story, and I really wish CDPR had done more to differentiate between the filler side quests and the more curated story missions that can be found within the side quest category of the journal. Make no mistake though, there's some really engaging storytelling to be had in this game. Whether it be in the main story, or the character-based arcs of Judy or Panam, or even just the mini arcs with the likes of the Crazy Taxis. I wanted to see what would happen next, and I haven't been this engaged with a AAA game in a very long time. It only took me a few hours to become completely hooked into this game, its world and its characters. The strength of the game here alone makes it Game of the Year material in my eyes. However, the developers did make one major misstep, something that is unforgivable in my opinion. When you're playing a game with RPG elements like Cyberpunk 2077, it's vital that the game remembers the choices that you've made and allows that to direct the events later on. The romance options in games like this are hugely important, because the protagonist's relationships with other main characters are obviously key to telling a good story, and the romance options are the pinnacle of that. The V that I played as got on well with the braindance technician Judy, and this relationship builds throughout the main story and her subsequent side missions. V and Judy were a great match and really cute together in my opinion. I have no complaints here at all, as I thoroughly enjoyed seeing their relationship blossom. My issue, however, was showcased at its worst in the later missions with NCPD Detective River Ward, and these missions came after V and Judy had made things official in my playthrough. You are simply given no dialogue option to tell River about your existing girlfriend Judy, so you have to sit through a painful mission where the voice actress of V flirts and leads River on, and only when River makes a final advance are you able to finally reject him. Not by saying, hey, by the way, I have a girlfriend, but by making him feel like he isn't good enough. And River is a really decent guy who deserved better. It was just painful to experience this mission and made me quite angry at the time, as this paints V to be someone who is emotionally manipulative and just a bit of a bitch, which is at odds with the V you play as for the rest of the game. The one who cares deeply about the characters she forms bonds with, the one that has been with River through some particularly dark times and clearly has respect for him. The romance in Cyberpunk 2077 should have been treated the same way that V's backstory is, with your choices unlocking dialogue options at the appropriate times throughout the remaining game. For example, when Nomad tribe member Panam Palmer first asked you to join her clan, that would have been a great time to be able to ask, what about my partner Judy? Can she come too? Unfortunately, it feels like the quests were written and designed in isolation, with no thought to how they would intersect with each other. This lack of continuity of the game failing to keep track of where you're at with major characters is a massive shame and does a huge disservice to the compelling characters that Cyberpunk 2077 has. Because it does have some really compelling characters. There's honestly too many good ones to list them all, and on top of that there's plenty of additional characters that only played small parts that could have had huge story arcs written about them too. But I have to mention the biggest character in the game besides Fee, Johnny Silverhand, played brilliantly by Keanu Reeves. Johnny Silverhand isn't just a character in this game, he's the second playable protagonist, inhabiting Fee's body, and the resulting dynamic between Fee and Johnny was fascinating. It actually created a level of distrust in the dialogue options for me at points, where I wasn't sure if it was just Fee's response or the result of Johnny's influence. I actually wish this game was maybe 2 or even 3 times longer, or that maybe it was broken into a trilogy, because all of the characters here, especially the dynamic between Fee and Silverhand, have so much potential here for more stories to be told, and ultimately the story we got feels too big in scope for the game's runtime, with so many compelling elements but not enough game time to really flesh them out. As a result, it feels like there's some big narrative leaps made at times. For example, River goes from just being your friend and having made no signs of his attraction, to suddenly missing you like he's in love with you with no character build-up, as if at least one mission has been cut in between. However, overall, the fact that I'm here complaining that there wasn't enough content on these characters and on this story is a testament to just how much I enjoyed this game. Like, you don't ask for more of something unless what you had was good. But unfortunately, this wouldn't be a Cyberpunk 2077 review if there wasn't a section dedicated to bugs. Yes, the game is very buggy, and waiting a few months to play the game would have very likely resulted in a better gaming experience. However, personally, I only experienced a couple of game-breaking bugs, issues that resulted in me having to restart or revert a save. Most of the bugs in my 100+ hour playthrough weren't game-breaking, and honestly were often quite amusing. I don't want anyone to think that I'm understating just how buggy this game is though. Honestly, don't think you could play it for more than 10 minutes, any point in the story, without noticing at least one thing that's not quite right. It is a very buggy game. I'm just saying that at no point did these issues cause me to want to stop playing. What works in Cyberpunk 2077 is more compelling than what doesn't. At least that's true for me. But my experience shouldn't take away anything from your experience with this game. If you found it to be unplayable, then you should be mad and you should get your refund. In my view, it's really important that everyone is allowed to talk about their experiences with a game, regardless of if that's positive or negative, because if only one side is allowed to speak, then that could potentially make it more difficult for developers to get to the bottom of why something isn't working as intended. Along with fixing the bugs though, I also think that CDPR have some work to do with some quality of life fixes. To name just a few, I don't think that rides belong in the quest journal, or on the map with the same icon as quests. Purchasing a car should not be a quest. Also, the minimap isn't well designed for driving at high speed, and you often overshoot your turning and have to double back on yourself, which can be very frustrating. I also think there should be a clearer way of knowing which guns can be displayed in your weapons hall in V's apartment, and protections in place to make sure you can't accidentally dismantle them. There needs to be quicker ways to do things in the menus, like crafting, selling, or moving multiple items at once, especially on PC where you could be using a keyboard and mouse. Also, what's up with how slow the lifts are in the year 2077? I get the feeling they've been designed this way to hide loading screens, but I bet I could move the entire install of Cyberpunk 2077 to a different drive in less time than some of those lifts take. Maybe this is so they could keep hard drive based gaming viable, but they've recommended an SSD for all PC gamers, even those on the lower spec, so this seems unnecessary. So, I want to end this review with a review score, even though review scores can be problematic. So I'm going to give Cyberpunk 2077 an 8 out of 10. But regardless of the number score, I think looking at the compelling characters and the breathtaking city and the impressive graphics, I think the Cyberpunk 2077 should also earn my Tasty Award. I've enjoyed this game far too much for a 6 or 7 to sit right, but there's just too many missteps, bugs and missed opportunities for the game to get a 9 or a 10. I do think that the score could be increased once all the bugs are fixed though, and I don't necessarily think that a 10 out of 10 is out of reach if they're willing to go back and make some larger changes, like for example recording new dialogue to fix the major relationship continuity problems. Cyberpunk 2077 is genuinely one of the best games that I've played in recent years, and it is a shame they weren't quite able to reach that masterpiece status. There's just so much here to like and enjoy, and I have high hopes for the future of the Cyberpunk franchise, should CDPR make a sequel, and I really hope that they do. If it was up to me, a sequel would again be set in Night City. That way CDPR can continue to develop and refine the amazing world they have built, rather than starting from scratch elsewhere. Just imagine how realistic Night City could become if it had another full development cycle. I have to say though, I personally have no interest in a multiplayer game, and I hope they change their mind on that and purely stick to single player storytelling instead, as that's truly where their strengths lie. So, that was my review of Cyberpunk 2077. It's a bit of a controversial one, as I know hating this game is very popular right now, but honestly, I just don't. It was great, and I highly recommend it to everyone who enjoys story-based games. So, let me know in the comments below what you think of this game, and let me know if you think I should make more game reviews. Also, if that's the case, please hit the like button to let me know that you like the video. I don't know if I'll be able to make this a regular thing though, as to be honest, very few games captivate me in the way Cyberpunk 2077 did. But yeah, so don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already and you want to see more of my videos, and maybe consider becoming Patreon, as their amazing generosity is what allows me to make this video and all of my videos and keeps the channel going. So thank you so much to my Patrons, and thank you to everyone for watching. Bye bye.